Welcome, everyone. Let's dive in. So we're looking into this radical idea that the very first gospel might not have come from the apostles at all, but from Marcion of Sinope.
Wild. Right. It's almost like history got rewritten by someone the early church tried so hard to erase.
Exactly. Marcion, around 140 CE, basically flipped the script by claiming that the Old Testament God, the judgmental, law-obsessed creator, was a false God. Instead, he said the true God was all about grace, revealed in Jesus.
And his take on Jesus was super radical. He portrayed Jesus as a kind of pure messenger of this pure, loving God who comes in to rescue humanity.
Yep, and here's where it gets really fascinating. Marcion didn't just preach. He actually compiled a canon, the very first New Testament we know of. Instead of a collection of several Gospels and letters, his canon included 10 of Paul's letters and one Gospel simply called the Gospel of the Lord.
Which, as scholars increasingly suggest, turns out to be an early version of Luke's Gospel. But not our Luke at all. It was stripped down. No nativity story, no genealogy, no temple references.
Yeah, it's like imagine a movie cut so drastically that all the background story is missing. Marcion's version starts right with Jesus in Capernaum, bypassing all the traditional build-up.
And this is why the church fathers, Tertullian, Irenaeus, Epiphanius, called it a mutilated Luke. They were pretty harsh about it.
True, but here's the kicker. Modern scholars like Matthias Klinghardt, Jason Bedun, and Marcus Vincent are now arguing, what if it wasn't that Marcion chopped parts off Luke? What if canonical Luke was actually the one who came later as sort of a reactionary counter?
Yeah, that's a radical shift. So you're saying that what we consider as the Luke we know might have been a deliberate expansion, adding things like the virgin birth, fulfilling Jewish prophecy, basically a corrective to Marcion's stripped-down account?
Exactly. It's like if you compare two recipes for a classic dish. One is super minimal, and the other adds all the spices to tailor it to local tastes. The church might have taken Marcion's minimal recipe and then bolstered it with extra elements to tie Jesus back into Jewish tradition.
That makes me think about Mark. Traditionally, we've always heard that Mark was the first gospel, written around 70 CE. But here's the twist. Marcion's gospel doesn't show any signs of dependence on Mark at all.
Right. Even though canonical Luke has similarities to Mark, Marcion's version consciously avoids the key elements we see in both Mark and Luke. No baptism by John, no transfiguration, no allusions to Psalm 22 in the crucifixion narrative. It's almost as if Marcion was delineating his own theological boundaries.
So does that imply that maybe Mark came after Marcion, or at least wasn't influential in Marcion's gospel?
That's exactly one of the daring propositions from these scholars. Some even argue that the Gospel of Mark might have been penned as a sort of counter-propaganda to challenge Marcion's theology. Where Marcion's Jesus is this ethereal, detached Savior, Mark's rendition is a bleeding, suffering Savior, deeply rooted in Jewish tradition.
I gotta ask, though, if Mark was a deliberate response, isn't it a bit counterintuitive that Marcion didn't simply adopt Mark's narrative? I mean, if Mark's gospel had already been circulating, why wouldn't a radical reformer like Marcion use it?
That's a critical point, and there are a few possibilities here. Either Mark truly hadn't been written or widely circulating when Marcion was building his canon, or Mark's message just didn't sit well with Marcion's theological stance. Essentially, Mark's portrayal of a suffering human Jesus was totally at odds with Marcion's idea of a divine, almost otherworldly messenger.
It almost feels like a battle of narratives, where the early Christian community was trying to define who Jesus was, right?
Absolutely. Think of it like two competing movie trailers for the same movie. One shows an almost superhuman, untouchable figure, Marcion's version, while the other shows a deeply wounded, relatable character, Mark's Jesus. Each trailer tries to grab the audience's sympathies in a totally different way.
And this narrative conflict forced the early church to make some big decisions. By defining orthodoxy, They essentially set aside Marcion's version as heresy and adopted the version infused with Jewish prophecy and suffering.
Exactly. And this whole process, as problematic as it is, might have been a catalyst for the eventual formation of the New Testament canon we recognize today. Marcion, despite being branded a heretic, inadvertently forced the early church to hash out what was orthodox and what wasn't.
Right. It's like his rebellion pushed them to really clarify their own identity and solidify their traditions. But isn't it a bit ironic that someone they tried so desperately to erase ended up shaping history?
Definitely ironic. I mean, think about it. Without Marcion forced them to respond, the church might not have defined its boundaries as sharply. His work essentially rewrote, or perhaps even inverted, traditional timelines, suggesting that what we often take as the earliest gospel narrative might actually be his version.
Mm-hmm. And that raises the question, what if the real origin of the gospel narrative, the very first written account of Jesus, came from a man labeled heretic? It turns everything on its head, doesn't it?
It really does. If Marcion's gospel is indeed the original, then canonical Luke becomes a kind of counter-narrative, a deliberate reframe of Jesus' story to align with Jewish tradition. And as for Mark, his gospel might not be the foundational text we've always believed, but rather a defensive reaction against Marcion's theology.
Yeah, exactly. I find that pretty fascinating, and also, admittedly, a bit unsettling. How do we even reconcile with the idea that what we consider traditional might be nothing more than a crafted response to a competing narrative?
That's a fair challenge. I mean, it really forces us to ask, who gets to decide what's orthodox? Is it the one who writes the gospel, or the one who later consolidates a narrative to fit a broader social or political agenda?
Mm-hmm. And it also puts the spotlight on how fluid these narratives were in the early centuries. There wasn't this neat, fixed canon from the get-go. It was a battleground of ideas with each faction trying to outdo the other in defining the nature of Jesus and his mission.
Exactly. And the fact that modern scholars are revisiting these theories shows that our understanding of early Christian history is still very much in flux.
Right.
I mean, these debates make you wonder, what other firsts have we taken for granted that might have a completely different origin story?
It kind of reminds me of those historical whodunits where every piece of evidence seems to twist the entire narrative. And if Marcion's gospel really predates Mark, then our textbook timelines might need a serious overhaul.
And consider the implications. If canonical texts are essentially responses to Marcion's ideas, then the entire New Testament could be seen as a product not purely of apostolic tradition, but as a crafted reaction to a radical alternative. That is, a truly transformative way to look at history.
I'm curious, though. Do you think there's a risk in overcomplicating the narrative by placing too much emphasis on Marcion? I mean, isn't it possible that we are, in a way, retroactively over-intellectualizing what might have been simply an early divergent tradition?
That's a respectful challenge. Sure, some of it might be over-analysis, but the weight of scholarly critique, that accurate, detailed analysis, warrants the re-examination of these texts. It's not just about glorifying Marcion, but rather understanding the dynamics of early Christian thought.
Yeah, I see that. And that, ultimately, might lead us to a richer, more nuanced comprehension of how these early narratives were formed, by conflict, debate, and genuine struggle over who Jesus was meant to be.
Absolutely. So whether you view Marcion as a heretic or as an unintentional pioneer, his influence on the formation of the New Testament is undeniable. His gospel forced the Orthodox Church to define itself, and by doing so, reshaped what would become the cornerstone of Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm. It really makes you wonder how many other truths we hold dear might be the end result of such intense ideological battles.
No doubt about it. And that's the beauty of history. It's like an ever-evolving conversation where each new discovery challenges our old assumptions and pushes us to rethink what we thought we knew.
Right on. Well, that was a fascinating dive into Marcion's world and his alternative gospel narrative. Thanks for unpacking all of that.
Anytime. It's always exciting to explore these deep, sometimes messy chapters of history that force us to question established beliefs. Until next time, keep questioning and stay curious.